She said 4 words. 4 words in a room full of women who called themselves godly, and not one of them moved. It hurts when I sit. That was all. No tears, no accusation. Just a 19-year-old girl who had learned over 5 years to say the most important things as though they were ordinary, because ordinary things don't get you punished. Nobody asked what she meant. Nobody wanted to know. Across the road, one man heard about it. He had not been in the room, he had not heard her say it, but he had been watching her for weeks, the way she placed her feet, the way she flinched when she sat down in church, the way her eyes never settled anywhere long enough to invite attention. He was a blacksmith who hadn't spoken a full sentence in 11 years. The town thought grief had made him strange. They were wrong about that. What grief had made him was someone who paid attention. And in Bell's Hollow, New Mexico, in the autumn of 1872, that turned out to be the most dangerous thing a man could be. Bell's Hollow, New Mexico, autumn 1872, the town woke slow. It always did. Bell's Hollow had a particular rhythm to its mornings, the way old things settle into their habits without being asked. The light came first thin and gold over the eastern mesas, spilling across the sandstone chapel that sat at the center of everything, like a patriarch at the head of a table. Then the smells: wood smoke, cornbread, baking somewhere behind closed shutters, the dry mineral scent of desert air before the heat had a chance to press the life out of it. Then the sounds: a wagon wheel, a dog, 2 men already arguing about something that probably did not matter. Bell's Hollow was not a cruel town. That is the important thing to understand about it, and the thing that makes what happened there possible. Cruel towns are easy. You can see cruelty coming. You can name it and press yourself against a wall to let it pass. But a comfortable town, a town that has built its comfort carefully over decades, and learned to protect it by agreeing without ever saying so out loud, not to look at certain things that might disturb it. That kind of town is something else entirely. That kind of town is where the worst things happen in broad daylight, with the church bells ringing on schedule, and the bread baking, and the dogs running in the street, and nobody can say afterward that they did not see. They can only say they chose not to understand what they were seeing. The Reverend Edmund Cross had been the moral center of Bell's Hollow's comfort for 22 years. He was a tall man, silver-haired, with the kind of face that belonged in a painting of something dignified. He preached with a measured warmth that made people feel simultaneously elevated and humbled, which is a rare skill and a dangerous one in the hands of a man without conscience. He had baptized every child under the age of 40 in this county. He had buried the fathers of half the men now raising their own families here. He had married the daughters, counseled the grieving, prayed over the sick, and never once in 22 years missed a Sunday. He also kept a girl in the back room of his house. Her name was Eliza Ward. She was 19 years old, and she moved like someone twice that age. Not slow, not clumsy, but careful in a way that healthy young women are not careful. Deliberate about each step, each motion, each adjustment of her weight from one position to another, as if her body had become a landscape she navigated with maps drawn from pain. She had honey blonde hair that she wore in a low knot at the nape of her neck, always because loose hair was vanity, and vanity was one of the many things that Hester Cross corrected. Her eyes were the particular blue of a sky an hour after sunrise, cornflower soft, and they had learned to move without settling anywhere long enough to invite attention. She had lived in the back room of the Cross house since she was 14. Before that, she had been a different kind of girl entirely, the daughter of Nathaniel and Abigail Ward, who had run a small dry goods operation on the county road east of town, and who had believed sincerely and without particular drama that their daughter deserved an education and a life of her own choosing. Then the fever summer came. It took her father first in July, quick and merciless. Her mother lasted until September, long enough to understand that she was not going to recover and to be afraid of what that meant for Eliza. Then she was gone too, and Eliza Ward was 14 years old, and alone in a county where alone meant something very specific and very dangerous for a girl without a male relation to speak for her. The Reverend Cross had taken her in, out of mercy, as he frequently reminded her, out of Christian charity, as he explained to the congregation, who had nodded and thought well of him for it. She had been given a room in the back of the house, a cot, a basin, and a set of daily obligations that grew over the 5 years that followed like debt compounded in silence, the borrower unable to renegotiate the terms. Her days began before the household stirred. She lit the fire. She hauled water from the pump in the yard. She cooked. She cleaned. She laundered. She attended every service and sat at the back of the chapel where her presence could be gestured to as evidence of the Reverend's generosity without her face being close enough for anyone to examine too carefully. She moved through Bell's Hollow like a shadow at noon present, but thin, occupying space without claiming it. Hester Cross managed her with the precision of a woman who had never wasted effort on cruelty she could achieve through efficiency. Salt rubbed into the scraped knuckles when work was done too slowly. The back of a wooden ladle applied to the shoulders when posture failed. No raised voices, no scenes, nothing that would carry through walls and lodge in the ears of neighbors as evidence of anything beyond a firm household with standards that a grateful young woman ought to be glad to meet. On the outer door of Eliza's room on the side that faced the hallway, there was a lock. No one in Bell's Hollow had ever remarked upon this. It is possible that no one had noticed. It is also possible that noticing it and not remarking upon it had come to feel like the same thing. On the morning this story properly begins, Eliza Ward carried two cast iron pots across the courtyard behind the chapel with her arms extended and her jaws set against the weight. The light was still young and pale. The town was just beginning to find itself. She moved at a pace that was neither hurried nor slow, the pace of a person who has been carrying things for a very long time and has made their peace with it. She reached the chapel kitchen door, set one pot down on the step, and adjusted her grip on the other. When she straightened up again, she placed a hand briefly against the small of her back. Just a touch, just a single private acknowledgement of something she did not permit herself to show. Then she picked the pot back up and went inside. The kitchen smelled of flour and wood smoke, and the particular sour undercurrent of a room where women gather to perform goodness. Three of the congregation wives were already there, moving around the long wooden table, with the practiced efficiency of women who had done this every Sunday for years. Sister Constance Weld, who was 60 years old and had the bearing of a woman who had been the oldest person in every room she had entered for the last decade, stood nearest the window, reviewing a list written in a cramped hand on brown paper. Eliza set the pots down, moved to the wood box near the stove, and crouched to begin stacking. The crouch was the problem. She managed it. She had become very skilled at managing the things that were problems, at making the management invisible, at letting the pain announce itself, and then closing a door on it before anyone could hear. She stacked three pieces of wood. She reached for a fourth, and the shift of her weight, the specific combination of angles that her body made in that position, produced something she was not quick enough to contain: a short, bitten breath, a sound barely larger than nothing. Constance Weld stopped reading her list. She turned and looked at Eliza with the brief calculation of someone deciding whether to engage with what they have noticed or let it pass into the general noise of a busy morning. "Why are you moving like that, child?" she said. Eliza stood. She kept her face arranged. "It hurts when I sit," she said. That is all. 4 words. A statement of fact offered without drama, without appeal, in a voice so flat and careful it could only have been shaped by years of practice, saying difficult things as though they were ordinary. The room held still for the length of one breath. Then Constance Weld gave a small, tight smile and said, "Perhaps you ought to mind your posture," and turned back to her list. The other women returned to their conversation. A pot was lifted. A question was asked about whether there was enough salt. The morning moved forward. Eliza went back to stacking wood. She did not look up. She did not allow herself the particular kind of hope that comes from thinking someone might have heard you. She had been in Bell's Hollow for 5 years. She had learned slowly and completely that the hope that someone has heard you is almost always more painful than the original silence. She stacked the rest of the wood. She rose. She went to work. Later that same morning, she was on her knees on the stone steps behind the chapel, scrubbing with lye water and a stiff, bristled brush that had lost most of its stiffness some months ago. The sun was climbing. The town was fully awake now, moving through its weekday routines with the self-assurance of a place that has been doing the same things for a long time and expects to go on doing them. She scrubbed. The motion required bending forward and pushing the brush in long strokes, which was fine. It was the moments between strokes when she shifted her weight that were not fine. She had developed a system for those moments, a series of small adjustments that distributed the problem across several points so that no single point bore enough of it to force a sound. She was concentrating on this system when she became aware of being watched. She did not lift her head. She had learned that lifting her head invited conversation, and conversation invited questions. And questions had never in her experience produced anything worth the price of being asked. She continued scrubbing, but something in the quality of the air behind her had changed some slight alteration in the sounds of the street as they organized themselves around a point of stillness, and after a moment she could not help it. She looked up. Across the road under the deep shadow of the blacksmith's awning, a man stood against the post with his arms loose at his sides and his hat pushed back on his head. He was very large. Not in the way that men who have worked hard become large, though he was certainly that too, but in some additional way that seemed to have less to do with physical dimension than with the particular stillness of him. The quality of contained force in the way he held himself, as if he were something geological rather than merely human. He was perhaps 38 years old, with dark auburn hair shot through with iron gray at the temples, and eyes that even at this distance were visible in their amber steadiness. His face was the face of a man who had spent a long time outdoors and a longer time in some interior weather that the outdoors had done nothing to ease. I was looking at her, not looking away, not shifting his gaze politely when he found himself caught, just looking with an attention that was neither predatory nor performative, that held no demand and made no show of itself. Simply looking at her the way a person looks at something they are trying to understand. Eliza Ward held his gaze for exactly 2 seconds. Then she turned back to her scrubbing. His name was Caleb Rourke. She had seen him before in the way that you see people in a town of 400 souls repeatedly and without particular awareness, the background becoming familiar without ever quite becoming known. He was the blacksmith who had set up in the space at the edge of the road about a year ago, or possibly longer. He did not come to services. He did not come to social gatherings. He spoke to people when it was required by the transaction at hand and did not speak otherwise. The town had decided he was a solitary man, possibly odd, probably harmless, and had filed him away in the mental category of interesting but not concerning. What the town did not know, because Caleb Rourke had said almost nothing about himself since he arrived, was that he had a daughter once. Her name had been Rose. She had been 7 years old when the fever took her, a small, serious child with hair the color of corn silk and a habit of leaving wildflowers on his anvil, when she came to visit the forge, arranging them with a deliberateness that suggested she understood that beauty required tending. She had been gone for 11 years. His wife Margaret had followed 8 months later, the grief and the winter between them, having done what the fever had not quite had the opportunity to finish. I had buried them both himself. Rose first in the hillside above the small homestead in Colorado where they had lived beneath a cedar tree she had named when she was 5, because she said it looked like it was listening. He had placed the last stone on her grave on a November afternoon in 1861, with his hands bleeding from the cold and the work. And when he stood up and looked at what he had done, he understood that he had no more use for his voice. Not as a vow, not as a punishment, simply as the natural consequence of a world in which the person who had most wanted to hear it was gone. He had spoken since. Necessity required occasional words, but not sentences, not unless the transaction demanded it, and not with anything in them beyond the minimum information required to complete the exchange. The town of Bells Hollow had interpreted this as eccentricity. They were wrong. It was grief in its most honest form, grief stripped of all performance and allowed to be exactly what it was. What Caleb Rourke was underneath all of it was a man who had spent 11 years learning to see very precisely. When you stop talking, you start noticing. He noticed things that the town occupied with its own conversations had ceased to attend to. He noticed the quality of Eliza Ward's stillness. He noticed how she placed her feet when she walked, and the way she sat at the back of the evening services, with her spine carefully arranged so that the least possible weight was on her hips. He noticed the particular kind of tiredness in her face, not the tiredness of work, but the tiredness of sustained vigilance, the exhaustion of someone who has been watching for danger for so long that watching has become indistinguishable from waking. He had seen that kind of exhaustion before. In the war, in men who had been too long under fire. In women who had appeared at the back gates of frontier forts, asking for bread in voices that were already prepared for refusal. In his wife in the months before she died, when she had stopped believing that telling him how frightened she was would change anything. He recognized it the way you recognize a language you learned in childhood and had thought you had forgotten. The evening service that Sunday was well attended. It always was. Reverend Cross had the gift of making the space inside the chapel feel both intimate and significant, and the congregation came each week with the reliable hunger of people who want to feel that their lives are part of something larger than the daily transaction of getting through them. The candles were lit, the pews were polished by decades of bodies pressing into them, and they held their warmth into the evening. The Reverend stood at his pulpit and delivered a sermon on the theme of submission and grace, the idea that true peace came from releasing one's own will into the hands of something wiser and more enduring. I was very good at this. His voice moved through the room like water finding its level, filling every corner without apparent effort. Several women wept quietly. Several men squared their shoulders with the particular posture of people who have been reminded of something they want to believe about themselves. Eliza Ward sat in the last pew alone. She had arranged herself on the bench with the system she had developed over months of Sunday evenings, a precise distribution of weight that minimized what needed to be minimized. For a while it worked. She sat and listened to the sermon and watched her folded hands in her lap, where the knuckles carried old marks she had learned not to examine in company. Rope burns, some people might have called them. Burns of some kind, certainly. The kind that come from being held. Then the Reverend made a particular point about surrender, and his voice rose with the emphasis of it, and the congregation leaned forward slightly, and Eliza shifted her weight to follow the movement of the room, and the shift went wrong. The sound that came from her was not loud. It was barely a sound at all, barely more than a sharp compression of breath, the kind of thing that in another context would have been noticed by no one. But it came in a gap between one phrase and the next, in the particular silence that a skilled preacher knows how to use, and in that silence it was enough. 3 heads turned. 4. The Reverend's eyes found her for a fraction of a second. Then he raised his voice deliberately, and the wave of his words broke over the moment and washed it away, and the heads turned back, and the sermon continued, and nothing had happened. Eliza looked down at her hands. They were trembling slightly, which was new, or perhaps not new, only newly visible to her. She breathed. She waited for the hymns. Outside the chapel, in the narrow space between the open doorway and the first shadow of the night, something was visible through the arch of the entrance. A wide-brimmed hat pushed back. A set of broad-shoulders arms crossed, leaning against the hitching rail without any particular urgency. Caleb Rourke had not come inside. He had also not left. The congregation sang. The Reverend lifted his hands, and outside where the lamplight did not quite reach, one man stood in the dust of Bell's Hollow's main road and watched what everyone inside had just decided not to see. 3 days after the Sunday service, Eliza was at the pump behind the chapel before the sun had properly cleared the eastern ridgeline. She was filling a metal bucket, and her knuckles were wrapped in strips of linen because the skin there had reopened sometime in the night, which happened when the weather turned cold and the skin dried out, and the work continued regardless. She wore a dress that had been laundered so many times it had gone from its original dark blue to the color of a winter sky. One of her eyes, if you looked at it in the right light, held the faded memory of a bruise that powder had been applied to reduce. She was not thinking about anyone. She was thinking about the bucket and the water and the sequence of tasks that waited between this moment and the end of the day when she would be permitted to stop. She had learned to think about sequences. Sequences were safe. Sequences had endpoints. You could survive almost anything if you kept your mind on the sequence and did not permit yourself to think about how long the sequences would continue or what would interrupt them. She did not hear him approach. He moved quietly for a large man, not sneaking, but simply not announcing himself with unnecessary sound. The way men who spend time outdoors learn to move through space without disturbing it. Are you all right? The voice was low and rough, the voice of someone who had used it infrequently for a long time and had not lost the capacity, but had lost some of the ease of it. She knew immediately who it was. She did not look up. She kept her hands on the pump handle. She kept her weight where it was. She said nothing. He did not move away. After a moment, she picked up the bucket and started toward the kitchen door. 2 steps. Then his voice again, and something in it that was different from what she had expected, which was the tone of someone making a claim or an offer or a proposal. This was different. This was a simple statement offered without decoration. You don't have to stay quiet. She stopped. The desert wind moved around them, carrying dust and the smell of sage from somewhere out past the edge of town. A wagon passed on the main road. The town was waking up and did not care about this particular moment in this particular alley behind the chapel of a man who had never in 22 years given it cause to doubt him. Without turning, she said, "That's what they told the last girl." 8 words, spoken in a voice that was completely flat, completely without appeal, the voice of someone reporting a fact they had no reason to expect would change anything. And then she walked through the kitchen door and let it close behind her. Caleb Rourke stood in the alley for a long time after that. That afternoon, he walked to the sheriff's office. The office was a low building with board walls and a porch that tilted slightly toward the street as if the whole structure were listening for something. Sheriff Silas Harwick was behind his desk, leaning back in a chair with a catalog open on his lap, a posture that communicated with complete efficiency his fundamental orientation toward the demands of any given day. He was a man in his mid-40s who had the kind of face that becomes difficult to read over time because it has learned to hold so many things simultaneously without committing to any of them. He looked up when Caleb came in. Something in his expression shifted almost imperceptibly, the way a man shifts when something he has been peripherally aware of has now arrived at his door and will require some kind of direct engagement. "Mr. Rourke," he said, "I had a feeling you'd come in sooner or later. Sit down." Caleb sat down across from him. He said, "The girl at the cross house. She's being hurt." Harwick let the silence breathe. He set the catalog down. He placed his hands on his desk in the considered way of a man about to deliver something he has rehearsed, not because he is dishonest, but because he has learned that certain conversations require a particular shape if they are going to remain manageable. "Eliza Ward," he said. "The Reverend's Ward." "Yes." "And what is it exactly that you've seen, Mr. Rourke, that's brought you to that conclusion?" Caleb told him. He said it plainly, without inflation, without appeal to the sheriff's emotions. He described what he had seen in the specific way of a man who has spent years paying attention. The walk, the flinch, the marks on her hands, the sound she made in the chapel. He said the thing about the last girl. Harwick listened. He was good at listening. It was one of the qualities that had gotten him the job. When Caleb was finished, the sheriff leaned back. "The thing is," he said, "what you're describing is a set of observations. And observations, particularly about a young woman living in a preacher's household in a town that has known that preacher for 20 years, are not the kind of thing that moves very easy in the direction of action." He paused. "The Reverend Cross has done a great deal for this community. His wife is a pillar of the women's auxiliary. If I go to them with something like this, based on the word of a man who has been here barely a year and doesn't come to services, I'm not going to make a lot of friends in this town." "I'm not asking you to make friends." "No," Harwick said. "I know you're not." He stood up, which was his way of indicating that the conversation had reached its natural end. But the situation you're describing, if there is a situation, is one that requires proof. Not impression, not concern. Proof. You bring me something I can actually use and we'll talk differently. Caleb stood. He picked up his hat. I buried my daughter 11 years ago, he said. Rose, she was 7. She never once flinched when I raised my voice. He put the hat on. I know what love looks like because I know what it doesn't. He walked out. By sundown, the word had moved through Bell's Hollow in the efficient, invisible way that words move in a place where nothing official travels faster than conversation. The blacksmith people were saying had gone to see Harwick about the Reverend's ward. The blacksmith who had been here barely a year, who did not attend services, who lived alone in that cabin at the edge of the canyon road, and spoke to almost no one, had apparently decided that the arrangement in the Cross household was his business. The Reverend heard this. He heard it at the gathering of the church board from a man who told him, with the gentle warning of someone delivering news they believe the recipient deserves to know. The Reverend nodded. He thanked the man. He adjusted his collar. He said that he would pray for Mr. Rourke, who struck him as a man with considerable grief in his past, and perhaps too much time to direct it outward. He smiled when he said it. He had a very good smile. That same evening, a second man became part of the story, though he did not yet know it in quite those terms. Emmett Garrow had arrived in Bell's Hollow 2 years earlier, in the autumn of 1870, with a sum of money enough to purchase 60 acres on the East Road and a herd of 20 cattle and nothing left over for anything else. He was 36 years old, built along the same large general lines as Caleb Rourke, but arranged differently with a ranginess to him that Caleb did not have, an ease of motion in the limbs that spoke of a man who had spent years in a professional pursuit rather than physical labor. Chestnut hair, green eyes that were sharp in the way of someone who has been trained to notice things, a jaw that had been broken once and healed at a slight angle that gave his face a character it had not had before the breaking. I had been a Pinkerton man. More precisely, he had been a Pinkerton man from 1858 until 1869, a stretch of 11 years during which he had investigated train robberies, land fraud, labor disputes staged to cover something else, and in 1864 a case in Memphis, Tennessee, that had required him to travel to a house of considerable community standing and speak to a young woman in private about what had been done to her in that house. The case had been airtight. The evidence had been specific, corroborated, and documented in the particular thorough way that Emmett Garrow did everything when he cared about the outcome. He had presented it to his supervisors in the Chicago office with complete confidence in what would follow. What followed was a meeting in a room with good upholstery and 2 senior men who explained with impressive patience that the subject of the investigation was an individual of considerable community standing, who had considerable friends in positions of considerable influence, and that proceeding with the case in the manner Emmett was proposing would create difficulties that extended well beyond the specific situation in Memphis. There was a word they used several times that Emmett remembered distinctly. The word was practical. It was presented as though it were a form of wisdom. He had complied. He had gone back to his desk and closed the case and filed the paperwork with the particular blankness of a man who has made a decision he knows he will carry for the rest of his life. The subject of the investigation was never charged. He remained in his position of community standing. Emmett, over the following years, received occasional intelligence through channels he maintained from habit, and through those channels he learned the names of 3 more young women who had passed through that man's sphere between 1864 and 1869. He had quit the Pinkertons in 1869. He had moved west with deliberate vagueness about his destination, the way a man moves when he is not running towards something, so much as placing as much distance as possible between himself and the particular shape his life had taken in one specific moment of one specific year. Bell's Hollow was as far as his money had taken him. He had built the fence and bought the cattle and found over 2 years that the distance did not change the weight of what he carried, because weight does not care about geography. I had seen Eliza Ward for the first time on a market day in September, 3 weeks before the morning, by the pump. He had seen the way she moved and had understood what the movement meant with the cold efficiency of a man trained to read people quickly and read them right. He had understood it, and he had said nothing because saying something required deciding what to do with what you knew, and Emmett Garrow had spent 7 years not doing that. That evening, after the word had circulated about Caleb's visit to the sheriff, Emmett rode out to the blacksmith's cabin at the edge of the canyon road. He found Caleb at the forge working a piece of iron that had already been worked to the point where further working was not improving it. Emmett tied his horse and sat on the bench outside without being invited and watched the fire. After a while, he said, "I heard you went to Harwick." Caleb did not look up from the iron. "I heard he sent you away." Caleb turned the iron. The forge light fell across his face in a way that showed the particular set of a man's jaw when he has decided something and is living inside that decision. "I have something to tell you," Emmett said, "about why I came here." Caleb set the iron down and waited. Emmett told him about Memphis. He told it the way he had never told it to anyone, without the management that comes from having rehearsed a version of a story for others' consumption straight through from the beginning to the closed file, and the names of the three women, and the day in 1869 when he had understood that he could not continue doing his job with the tools they had given him to do it. When he was done, the forge was the only sound. The fire crackled and moved. Beyond it, through the open side of the structure, the New Mexico night was enormous and still. "I know what that house looks like," Emmett said, "from the inside. I know what that arrangement looks like, and I know what happens to the girl when nobody does anything." Caleb looked at him. "I'm not going to let it happen again." Not a declaration, not a promise made to impress, just a statement of where he had arrived after 7 years of carrying a closed file and a list of 3 names after 2 years in Bell's Hollow, watching what the town preferred not to see. A man naming the decision he had already made. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded. "Once. Men confirm some agreements without words. This was one of those. That was the whole of it. That was how it began. They did not act immediately. This is important to understand. They were not reckless men. Reckless men are simple. These were men who understood that moving wrong would make things worse for the person they were trying to help. And so they did not move at all for several days, which was its own kind of discipline. Emmett in those days rode the long way to town when he had business there, taking the road that passed behind the chapel, watching without appearing to watch. Caleb worked his forge and observed the patterns of the Cross household through the ordinary prism of a man whose shop was across the road from everything. What they both saw was the same: a young woman performing the most demanding and least acknowledged work of the household with a steadiness that was not peace. She was not at peace. She was enduring, which is a different thing, though. From the outside, they can look identical to those who prefer not to distinguish between them. She scrubbed the chapel steps in the morning before anyone else arrived, on her knees in the cold with the brush, working back and forth across the stone in long, repetitive strokes. She hauled water twice a day. She prepared meals that other people ate while she stood near the stove and waited to see if anything was needed. At services, she sat at the back and held herself in the specific, careful way she had developed and said nothing. The town moved around all of this with the unconscious efficiency of people who have agreed not to see something and have been doing it long enough that the agreement has become invisible to them. On the sixth night, Eliza Ward did not sleep. She lay in the room above the main house with her knees drawn up and her blanket pulled to her chin, and she listened to the house settle around her. Below, the Reverend had come home late, which was not unusual, trailing the familiar combination of pipe smoke and something else she had learned not to name. He had gone to his study, she had heard the chair, then silence. She listened to the silence and she thought about 8 words. That is what they told the last girl. She had said it to close a door. She had said it as a kind of armor, the preemptive acknowledgement of disappointment. Before disappointment had a chance to arrive unannounced. She had said it because she had trained herself over 5 years to expect nothing from anyone, and the armor had served her well enough that she had stopped noticing she was wearing it. But the man had not reacted the way she had expected. He had not offered protest or reassurance or the particular kind of helpless sympathy that people offer when they want to feel useful without incurring any cost. He had simply stood there after she walked away, and when she had looked back from the corner she had not been planning to look back from, he was still standing in the same place, with the same stillness, looking at nothing in particular. Not defeated, not discouraged, simply present in the way of someone who has decided to remain and does not require the situation to accommodate itself to his comfort. She was not accustomed to that. She had no framework for it. It moved around inside her in the night in a way she could not organize or dismiss. She sat up, in the dark, moving with the slow, deliberate care that she moved with. Always she reached under the edge of the cot and drew out the small tin she kept there. She opened it. Inside, a handful of coins she had been accumulating for 2 years, in amounts too small to notice a length of good thread, a sewing needle, a photograph she had carried since she was 14, of her mother and father standing in front of the store on the county road on a summer morning, her mother's hand tucked into her father's arm, both of them looking at something off to the left of the frame with expressions that suggested the person behind the camera had just said something worth looking at. She looked at their faces for a long time. Then she reached for the worn Bible that sat on the shelf above her cot, the one she had carried out of the house on the county road in September of 1867, with everything she could carry in her arms. It fell open to Psalm 71, which it always did, which she had long since stopped thinking was coincidence. She read the first verse without sound, only her lips moving. In thee, O Lord, do I put my trust. Let me never be put to confusion. She closed the Bible. She looked at the space around her, which was small and cold, and contained by careful accounting almost nothing that was hers. The room, the cot, the cracked basin on the shelf, the nail above the door on which she hung her dress at night. Through a gap in the roof boards, through a space no larger than her palm, a single star was visible. She had looked at that star many nights without naming it, because naming things gives them weight, and she had been trying for 5 years to travel light. She looked at it now and made without naming it as a decision. She put the coins in her pocket. She tucked the thread and the needle and the photograph into the folds of the Bible. She sat on the edge of the cot and held these things in her lap and did not allow herself to think further than the next step, because further than the next step was where fear lived, and she could not afford to visit it tonight. Through the gap in the roof, the star held its position. Outside the town of Bell's Hollow slept with the untroubled depth of a place that has made its arrangements and is satisfied with them. At the edge of the canyon road in a cabin lit by the last of a banked fire, Caleb Rourke sat in the chair by the window with his hands still and his eyes open, looking at the dark in the direction of the main street, the way a man looks at something he cannot see yet, but has already decided not to look away from. 2 miles east, at the kitchen table of a ranch house with 60 acres of fence around it, Emmett Garrow sat with a piece of paper in front of him and a pen in his hand and the address of a women's home in Abilene, Texas, that he had known about for 7 years without ever writing to. He looked at the blank paper, he looked at the address. Then he picked up the pen and wrote the first sentence of a letter that was 8 years overdue. The night held everything it held and waited and did not promise anything. The morning after Emmett Garrow wrote his letter, Eliza Ward hung laundry in the dirt yard behind the Cross house in the full press of midday heat. The lines ran between two posts that Reverend Cross had put up 10 years ago for this purpose, and they sagged slightly in the middle. Now the way things do when they have been holding weight for a long time without maintenance. The sheets and aprons moved in the dry air like empty people. Eliza worked steadily down the line, pinning each piece with the economical motion of someone who has performed this task so many times that the body knows it without being asked. Her feet were bare on the cracked earth. The sun was direct and without mercy. She heard the back door open. She did not turn around. She knew the sound of that door, knew every particular creak and weight of it, in the way that people who live inside situations they cannot control develop an acute sensitivity to every sound and shift of those situations. She reached for the next piece of wet cloth and continued, "Still got enough strength to lift linens." Hester Cross's voice had a quality that Eliza had spent 5 years trying to find a name for. It was not a shouting voice. It was not even an unkind voice, not in any way that could be pointed to and labeled as such. It was a voice that had learned to deliver its content in the register of reasonableness, so that what it said and how it said it occupied different moral territories, and only the one you could prove was ever available for examination. Then I suppose your back isn't broken after all, Hester said. Eliza reached for a pin. She did not answer. You think because some blacksmith raised his eyebrows, the world is going to arrange itself differently. Hester had stepped out of the doorway now and was moving across the yard, not quickly, with the measured pace of a woman who has decided that this conversation requires a certain proximity to land correctly. Men like Caleb Rourke come to situations like yours because they want something broken to fix. It isn't charity, it isn't concern. It is the same thing men have always done, which is find a use for whatever is available. She stopped a few feet behind Eliza. He doesn't see you, she said. He sees a burden. Eliza pinned the last corner of the sheet. She reached for the next piece, and then from some place she had not known was still open inside her. A response came up without her planning it, in a voice that was quiet but that did not tremble. Better to be a burden than a ghost. The silence that followed lasted perhaps 2 seconds. Then Hester Cross struck her across the mouth. It was not a blow delivered in rage. That was the thing about it that Eliza would carry longer than the pain itself, which faded in days. It was delivered in the flat corrective manner of someone addressing an error. No intake of breath before it, no change of expression after it. Palm against skin, and then the stillness resumed as if a small necessary adjustment had been made and could now be set aside. Eliza did not fall. She had learned over the course of 5 years how to absorb impact without losing her footing, and this knowledge lived in her body now below the level of thought. She took one step back. She touched her lip with the back of her hand. She looked at what came away on her knuckles. Then she turned back to the line and reached for the next piece of wet cloth. Hester said nothing more. After a moment, she went back inside. The door closed. Eliza continued down the line, pinning each piece with the same economical motion, the same unhurried steadiness. If you had watched from a distance, you would not have known anything had happened. That was the skill. That was the thing 5 years had built in her that no one had intended to build, but that she had assembled piece by piece from necessity, the way people in siege conditions learn to find resources in places that were never designed to provide them. But her hands, if you had been close enough to see them, were absolutely still. Not the stillness of calm, the stillness of someone who has made a final decision and is waiting for the moment to enact it. That evening, Caleb Rourke walked into town, not on horseback, on foot, slowly with the particular deliberateness of a man who is not arriving casually and wants this to be legible. He came down the main road from the north, passing the dry goods store and the post office and the barber shop, where two men on the bench outside stopped their conversation to watch him go by. He did not acknowledge them. He was not performing indifference. He simply had a destination and was moving toward it. He walked to the chapel. The front doors were open as they often were in the evenings. Light from the interior fell across the stone steps that Eliza had scrubbed that morning on her knees. Caleb went up the steps and through the doors without hesitating. Inside, Reverend Edmund Cross was at the front of the chapel adjusting the placement of hymnals on the rack below the first pew, with the focused attention of a man who believes that the arrangement of small things reflects the character of large ones. He heard footsteps and turned, and his face opened into the particular expression he had been practicing for 22 years. The warm and slightly surprised welcome of a man who considers the chapel his home and receives visitors to it with generous grace. When he saw who it was, the warmth did not disappear exactly. It recalibrated, subtly professionally, the way a skilled performer adjusts for an unexpected element in the room. "Mr. Rourke," he said, "I confess I had not expected to see you here. Have you come seeking prayer?" "No." The single word fell into the chapel's acoustics and did not echo so much as settle, landing with a flatness that the space was not accustomed to. Cross held his expression. "Then what brings you to this house at this hour?" Caleb came up the center aisle. He stopped perhaps 10 feet from the Reverend at the edge of the space where the pews ended and the open floor before the pulpit began. He looked at the pulpit. He looked at the hymnals. He looked at the reverend. She shouldn't be under your roof, he said. Cross went very still. The warmth left his face entirely now, not replaced by anything dramatic, simply withdrawn like a lamp being turned down. I beg your pardon. You don't feed her. You don't shelter her. Those are things you do for a person. You keep her like something that belongs to you, like a dog that flinches when you raise your hand because raising your hand has taught it to. Now see here. Cross's voice had found its gravity, the deep, authoritative register he used from the pulpit when the congregation needed to understand that a line had been drawn. What you are suggesting about this household is an offense against everything this church stands for. I have given that young woman a home when she had nothing. I have given her purpose and structure and the grace of Christian community when the world gave her fever and an empty house. I know what you've given her, Caleb said. The silence in the chapel had the thick, specific quality of a silence that follows something that cannot be taken back. Cross adjusted his collar. He pressed his hands together in front of him in the posture of a man gathering patience. You are treading on extraordinarily dangerous ground, he said quietly. I would encourage you very sincerely to consider what you are doing here and who you are doing it to. Caleb picked up his hat from the pew where he had set it when he came in. He put it on. He looked at Cross one more time with the amber steadiness that the Reverend in that moment found he could not meet. I buried my daughter 11 years ago, Caleb said. Her name was Rose. She was 7 years old. She never flinched when I raised my voice because I never gave her a reason to. He moved toward the door. That's how I know what love looks like, because I know what it isn't. He walked out. He did not see what was in the vestibule. Eliza Ward had come to the chapel that evening to retrieve a shawl she had left draped over the railing of the back vestibule that morning. She had not known he was inside. She had heard his boots on the stone floor and had pressed herself against the inner wall of the vestibule doorway with her bundle of shawl clutched to her chest, and she had listened. She had listened to every word. She stood there for a long time after his footsteps faded down the outside steps. The chapel was quiet around her. The hymnals sat in their rack. The candles on the altar were lit for no particular service, only because this was a house that kept its lights on as a statement of availability, of perpetual welcome, of the generosity of the man who tended it. She looked at the pulpit from which she had heard over 5 years so many careful arrangements of language about mercy and grace, and the particular blessings that come to those who bear their trials without complaint. For the first time in 5 years, someone had said inside this building, in the presence of the man who ran it, the precise truth that she had only ever allowed herself to think in the dark of the room above the stairs where the lock was on the outside of the door. It moved through her like water through cracked ground, finding every place that had dried out and filling it so suddenly it almost hurt. She did not cry. She stood in the vestibule with her shawl against her chest and let it move through her, and when it had passed, she was still standing, which seemed important. She folded the shawl carefully and went home through the back way. That night she packed. She did it without drama, without the ceremonial weight that the moment might have warranted in a different kind of story. She moved in the dark of the room with the focused quietness of someone who has determined what needs to happen and is simply making it happen one small action at a time. The tin with the coins, the thread and needle, the photograph of her parents, the Bible, a spare set of stockings, the small jar of ointment she used on her hands when the skin cracked badly in cold weather. She tied these things into her shawl and knotted the shawl at two corners so it could be carried in one hand. She sat on the edge of the cot for a moment. She looked at the room. It had been her room for 5 years, which ought to have given it some character of belonging, and yet it had none. It was still the room of the person it had been before she arrived, blank provisional offering nothing of itself. She took a small folded piece of paper from inside the Bible. She had written on it earlier that evening in the small, careful handwriting she had taught herself from her mother's letters, sitting by the window of the house on the county road in Ohio when she was 9 years old, and the future had contained none of what it would turn out to contain. The note said, "If anything happens to me, please give this to the man who noticed." She did not sign it. She did not need to. She tucked it into the knot of the shawl bundle so that it would be visible without being searched for. Then she waited. She waited until the house had been silent for an hour past the Reverend's return. She listened to the particular silence that means everyone in a house is genuinely asleep rather than merely quiet. When she was certain, she rose from the cot, picked up her bundle, and crossed the room in her stockings without making a sound. The stairs required care. She knew every board in them by its sound intimately and without having chosen to. She tested each one with the ball of her foot before committing her weight. 4th from the top far left side, 7 from the bottom center. She descended in the dark with the patience of someone for whom patience had become not a virtue, but a survival mechanism. In the parlor, Hester Cross was asleep in her chair by the cold fireplace. A glass had tipped on its side on the floor near her foot, not broken, the last of its contents long since absorbed into the rug. The Reverend was not home. Eliza crossed the parlor without breathing. She set her bundle down at the front door very carefully so that the jar of ointment did not knock against anything inside the shawl. She took the folded note and placed it on top where it could be found. Then she opened the front door, which she had oiled 3 weeks ago in the course of a morning's general housework, with no particular plan in mind at the time, and stepped out into the night. The air was cold and clean, the way desert air is cold after the sun has been gone long enough. The stars were extraordinary. She had always known they were there, but had rarely had occasion to look at them without the implication that she ought to be somewhere else. She walked north on the road out of town, then west on the canyon road, then turned off it onto the track that she had observed from a distance, leading to the blacksmith's cabin. She had memorized the route some days ago without quite acknowledging to herself why she was memorizing it. She walked for 40 minutes. The bundle was lighter than she had expected. She had expected it to feel like something like a weight she was finally carrying rather than leaving behind. But it was just a shawl with some objects in it, and the night was quiet, and the only thing she felt as she walked was the particular cool of the air against her face, and a sensation she had no word for. That was close to what she imagined vertigo felt like, except that instead of falling, she was rising. At the cabin, the fire was banked low. She could see the orange edge of it through the gap at the bottom of the door. She stood on the step for a moment. Then she knocked. 2 times, not loud. The door opened almost immediately, which told her he had been awake. He stood in the doorway with the forge light behind him and looked at her. She was soaked through from the mist that had rolled in off the mesas in the last hour. Her hair had come loose from its knot and was plastered in pieces to her face. Her dress was torn at the hem where she had caught it on the fence post turning off the canyon road. She said, "I'm sorry." He stepped aside without speaking and held the door open. Inside, he found a blanket and put it around her shoulders. He went to the stove and poured water into the basin he kept for washing warm water. He had kept there against some unnamed instinct, and set it on the table in front of her. He sat across from her and examined her wrists in the direct functional way of a man checking for injury, not sentiment, turning them over in his large calloused hands and looking at what was there, and setting them back down without commentary. He gave her a cup of broth that he heated quickly on the stove. She held it in both hands and drank it without tasting it. They did not speak for a long time. The fire worked quietly in the forge. Outside, the canyon road was empty, and the night went on being vast and indifferent to particular human arrangements, as it always did. She said, "I left everything." "Good," he said. She looked at him across the table. "That's all you'll say." He considered this seriously without apparent concern about what the consideration looked like from the outside. Then he said, "Sometimes leaving is louder than shouting." She looked at him for a moment longer. Then something happened to her face that was not quite a smile, but occupied the same territory, a brief softening, a slight release. She looked down at the cup. She leaned her head back against the chair and closed her eyes. Not to sleep. She was not ready for sleep, or perhaps did not trust it, or perhaps simply had not yet assembled the permission to want it. But she rested in the specific way of someone who has arrived somewhere that does not require anything of them, and the quality of her stillness changed from the vigilance it had been all evening into something that was simply still. In the morning, the Reverend found the bundle on the threshold. He stood in the doorway in his morning coat with the note in his hand, reading it twice. The handwriting was Eliza's. He recognized it from the household accounts she maintained. He looked up at the empty house behind him and at the empty parlor where Hester was still asleep in the chair, and then he looked back at the note. He folded it with two precise creases and put it in the pocket of his coat. Then he went to wake his wife. "She's gone," Hester said, standing in the doorway of the empty room upstairs, looking at the bare cot with an expression that moved through several things quickly and settled on nothing. "Yes," the Reverend said. "You think it was the blacksmith?" He did not answer this directly. He was looking at the room, at the basin on the shelf, at the nail above the door, at the gap in the roof boards that let in a finger of morning light. He looked at these things with the careful attention of a man inventorying a situation. "I think," he said finally in the voice he used when he was constructing something rather than reporting something, "that it is time for this community to remember who built it." Hester looked at him. "You're going to make a sermon of it?" "No," he said. He turned from the doorway. His voice, when he spoke again, had the quality of something already decided. "I am going to make an example." By mid-morning, the bell was ringing, not at the usual hour, not for a scheduled service. The Reverend had sent word through 3 households in the space of an hour, and the word had done what word always does in a town of 400 people, with nothing more pressing than its own concerns. It moved. People came. They came uncertain on a workday, which meant something significant was happening, and in a town like Bell's Hollow, significant things commanded attendance. The chapel filled. Reverend Cross stood at his pulpit in his full Sunday attire, which he wore on this Wednesday, with the conscious deliberateness of a man communicating through presentation. Hester stood at his side, chin elevated, hands folded, with the specific posture of a woman performing solidarity with something she has not been given the full story of, but knows better than to question. On the pulpit, Eliza's bundle sat in the place where the Bible normally rested. The Reverend did not open with prayer, which was unusual, in which the congregation noted. He looked out over the pews for a moment, letting the silence do the preparatory work he would normally assign to an opening verse. Then he said, "My flock." His voice had its full Sunday resonance. He had spent 22 years developing it, and he knew precisely what it could do. "We find ourselves in a moment of trial," he said, "a moment that asks something of this community, of its faithfulness, of its willingness to protect what it has built." He gestured toward the bundle on the pulpit. "This young woman was given a home by this church when the world gave her nothing. She was given meals, shelter, purpose, and the company of a believing community. She was given all of this because the grace of God moves through human hands, and these hands extended themselves on her behalf." He paused. "And now she has chosen to walk away from that grace, to walk toward a man who does not kneel in prayer, who has contributed nothing to this community, who has been here barely long enough to know its roads, let alone its values." He let this rest. "I do not tell you this for judgment," he said, his voice dropping to the softer register that indicated genuine pastoral concern rather than rebuke. "I tell you this because this community has always been its own protection, its own guardian, and it must know when something has come among it that does not belong there." The congregation was very quiet. At the back of the chapel, Constance Weld sat with her hands in her lap and looked at the bundle on the pulpit and thought about a girl in the kitchen who had said in a voice that had tried not to mean anything that it hurt when she sat down. Constance had been thinking about this intermittently for several days, in the way you think about something you have put in a drawer that you can hear making a small sound in there. She looked at the bundle. She looked at the Reverend's face. She thought about the drawer. Then she looked at her hands and did not say anything. This is how it works always. Not through the sudden conversion of the wicked, but through the small repeated silences of the reasonable. The good people who have something to lose, who have built something they are afraid to damage, who look at what they know and decide that the timing is not quite right, or the evidence not quite sufficient, or the cost of speaking not quite worth what speaking would purchase. Constance Weld was not a wicked woman. She was a reasonable one. And on this Wednesday morning, she stayed in her seat and said nothing. And the Reverend finished his sermon, and the congregation filed out into the October sunlight with the particular troubled quiet of people who have been told something they are not sure they believe, but are not sure they have the standing to dispute. At Dry Creek Ridge, Caleb was splitting wood in the clear morning when the sheriff's horse came up the track. Eliza heard the hooves from the porch where she sat with the blanket still around her shoulders, and she rose before the horse had cleared the last bend, standing with her back straight and her hands quiet at her sides. This posture, Caleb noticed from where he stood with the axe, was not the posture she had been using for 5 years in Bell's Hollow. It was different. It was the posture of someone who has decided to take up the space they are standing in. Silas Harwick came up the track and stopped his horse and looked at both of them with the evaluating expression of a man who was finding the situation somewhat different from what the report had led him to expect. "Morning," he said. Caleb set the axe down. "I understand the young lady left the Cross household last night," Harwick said. His voice was careful, professionally neutral, which was how he sounded when he was not yet committed to a position. "Reverend Cross has expressed some concern." "She left on her own," Caleb said. "She's here on her own." Harwick looked at Eliza. She met his gaze. In the morning light with nothing between them, in it there was no powder, no careful arrangement of light, no other thing to direct the eye. Harwick looked at her jaw. He looked at her wrists, which were visible below the edge of the blanket. He looked at the particular arrangement of her face, which was not fearful, not performatively brave, but something else. Something that had the quality of a person who has stopped spending energy on concealment. I had been a lawman for 14 years. He had sat across from enough people in enough situations to know the difference between someone telling him what they needed him to hear and someone simply being exactly what they appeared to be. He looked at Eliza Ward and felt somewhere behind the careful professional neutrality, the particular discomfort of a man who has just understood that the thing he avoided examining has now arranged itself directly in front of him. "She's not a fugitive," Eliza said. "No," Harwick said. "She is not." He let a moment pass. "But the Reverend holds considerable standing in this town, and that standing is going to make itself heard." "Let it," Caleb said. Harwick looked at him, looked back at Eliza. He adjusted the reins in his hands in the way of a man buying himself a moment to decide something. "I'll tell you both plainly," he said. "Cross won't let this settle. It's going to get loud before it gets quiet. You should know that." Then he turned his horse and rode back down the track without another word. They watched him go. After a moment, Eliza said, "He saw it." "Yes," Caleb said. "Whether he does anything with it is a different question." He picked up the axe. "It is." She turned back to the canyon and stood looking out at it in the late morning light. Something had shifted in the set of her shoulders, a small adjustment to the internal architecture of how she held herself upright, as if the simple fact of being seen by someone with authority had rearranged something she had been holding crooked for a very long time. 3 weeks after the sheriff's first visit to Dry Creek Ridge, Emmett Garrow received a reply from Abilene. He had not told Caleb he was expecting one. He had not told anyone. He had sent the letter and said nothing about it because he was not yet sure what he was building, and he had learned in 11 years as an investigator and 7 years of regretting how he had used that training that the time to speak about something is when you have something concrete to say. The reply came in two parts, which he had not expected. The first was on the letterhead of the Weston Home for Women in Abilene, Texas, signed by the home's administrator, confirming that a woman named Clara Sims had been a resident of the home from the spring of 1869 until the autumn of 1871, when she had been discharged in good health and relocated to family in East Texas. The note confirming her admission indicated that she had been transferred from Bells Hollow, New Mexico, at the request of her guardian, one Reverend Edmund Cross. The second part was a letter. It was not on institutional letterhead. It was on plain paper written in a hand that was careful and deliberate, the hand of someone who had learned to write well and was being particularly careful about this specific act of writing. It had been sent. The envelope indicated not to Emmett Garrow, but to the Weston home itself, addressed to no one specific, marked only for anyone who is still listening. The home's administrator had included it with the response because she wrote in a brief separate note it seemed like it might be relevant to whatever inquiry had prompted his letter. Emmett read it once. Then he read it again slowly at the table in his kitchen with the morning light coming through the east window. Clara Sims had written, "I do not know who will read this or whether reading it will change anything. I am writing it because I cannot keep it inside a drawer any longer. I was not the first girl in that house. There was one before me. I never knew her name because she was gone before I arrived and her name was not used. I know only that there was a room with a lock on the wrong side of the door, and that the Reverend referred to it once in my hearing as having been necessary with the previous arrangement. I write this so that if there is another girl after me, someone will be able to say we knew. We were told. We chose to believe her. Clara Sims, formerly of Bells Hollow, New Mexico." Emmett sat with the letter in his hands for a long time. Outside, his cattle moved in the near pasture with the patient, undirected energy of animals that require tending. The sun moved. The morning became late morning. Then he saddled his horse and rode to Dry Creek Ridge. He found them both there, Caleb repairing a section of the old fence line, and Eliza inside the main structure of the old homestead, visible through the open doorway, working at something he could not see from the track. The homestead was dilapidated but structurally sound in its bones, the kind of thing a person could fix given time and the willingness to believe it was worth fixing. Caleb came to meet him at the fence line. Emmett handed him both documents without explanation. Caleb read them. He read slowly the way he did everything without hurrying toward the end. When he was finished, he looked up. Something in his expression was very quiet and very certain, the expression of a man who has been waiting for a word he suspected existed and has just heard it for the first time. "She needs to see this," he said. "Yes." Caleb went to the doorway and spoke to Eliza without going inside. A moment later she appeared. She came across the uneven ground without hurrying and stopped next to Caleb. Emmett handed her the letter. She read it, standing up in the way she did most things, as if sitting down were still a transaction that required deliberate management. He watched her face as she read. It changed in ways that were small and significant, the way a landscape changes when the light shifts. Everything's still there but different in character. When she looked up, her eyes were dry. Whatever she was feeling was happening in some interior space that her face was not reporting on. "There was a girl before me," she said. It was not a question. "Yes," Emmett said. She looked at the letter again. She read the last line. "We chose to believe her." "What do I do with this?" she asked. Nobody spoke for a moment. The wind came through the canyon with a sound like something drawing breath. Then Emmett said, "You go back. You stand up in that chapel, and you read this letter where everyone can hear it." She looked at him. "They won't believe me." "Some won't. The Reverend has been there 22 years. I've been in that town 5. I have no family here, no standing, no one who will vouch for me in any arena that this community considers worth vouching in." Emmett held her gaze. "I know," he said. "I know exactly what you're walking into. I've been in enough rooms where the outcome was decided before the evidence was presented to know what they look like." A pause. "And I'm telling you to go back anyway, because this is what you have. And because the other option is to let the thing that has already happened to 2 girls happen to whoever comes after you." Silence. The cattle moved in Emmett's pasture 2 miles east. A hawk crossed overhead without interest in any of what was below it. Then from somewhere far below them on the canyon road, they heard a third horse. They turned to look, all 3 of them. The rider came up the track at a careful pace, and when he cleared the last turn and they could see his face, it was Silas Harwick. He had his hat in his hand rather than on his head, which was different from how he had arrived the last time. He came up to the fence and stopped his horse and looked at the 3 of them. "I've been thinking," he said, "about what I saw several weeks ago." He was speaking to Eliza. He was looking at her directly without the evaluating calculation of before, with something cleared away to make room for the simpler act of seeing. "I have not been able to stop thinking about it, which is in my experience the way a thing tells you it needs to be addressed." He looked at the papers Eliza was still holding. "I don't know what those are," he said. She held them out. He read both documents on horseback slowly with his horse standing patient beneath him and the canyon wind moving around all of them. When he finished, he lowered the papers and looked at Eliza. "What do you want to do?" he said. "She wants to go back," Emmett said. Harwick kept looking at Eliza, waiting for her. "I want to go back," she said. "I want to stand in that chapel and read that letter where everyone who has sat in those pews can hear it. I want to do it with you, standing next to me, which is not something I should have to ask for, but that I am asking for anyway." Harwick was quiet for a moment. "All right," he said. "We go in the morning." He handed the letters back to Eliza. He put his hat back on his head. "I want you to understand what tomorrow is going to look like. Cross will not accept this quietly. This congregation has been built on his authority, and they have been building on it for a long time. Some of them are going to choose the structure over the truth because the structure is what they know, and the truth is going to cost them something." "I know," Eliza said. "You know it as a concept," Harwick said. "Tomorrow you'll know it's standing up in the middle of it." "Then I'll know it's standing up," she said. He looked at her for a moment longer. This young woman in borrowed clothes at the edge of a half-ruined homestead at the rim of a New Mexico canyon, holding two pieces of paper that were going to change everything or change nothing, depending on whether the people in that chapel were able when the moment arrived to choose something harder than comfort. Then he turned his horse and rode back down the track. Caleb and Emmett stood at the fence. Eliza stood between them with the letters held to her chest and the canyon at her back. "I'll go alone," she said. "Into the chapel. Just me." Caleb started to speak. "Not yours to fight," she said. Not harshly, plainly the way she said most things. "I need you outside. I need to know you're outside. But the inside is mine." A long moment. "All right," Caleb said. She went back inside the homestead. They could hear her moving around in there, the small, specific sounds of someone making arrangements for the next day. After a while, the sound settled, and then there was only the wind. Emmett looked at the canyon. Caleb looked at the track Harwick had ridden down. Both of them were thinking about tomorrow, about the chapel and the congregation, and the reverend who had built 22 years of careful structure out of this community's willingness not to examine him, and about a young woman who was going to walk into the center of all of that with two pieces of paper and a voice that had been trained by 5 years of silence to say only what was absolutely necessary, which meant that what she said would be absolutely necessary. "She's going to be all right," Emmett said, not asking. "She was always going to be," Caleb said. That night in the Cross House on the main road of Bell's Hollow, the Reverend sat alone in his study with a single candle and his hands flat on the desk in front of him. He had the note. He had read it many times. He knew whose handwriting it was, and he knew what it meant. And he had spent weeks now performing the serene certainty of a man whose position is unassailable because the alternative to that performance was to let the room see what was underneath it. I was not afraid exactly. He had been in positions before that required careful management. He was experienced at management. He understood how communities worked, how they chose their allegiances, how they protected what they had already decided to believe about the people who led them. But he was sitting with his hands flat on the desk, which he did not normally do, and the candle was burning lower than he had intended to let it burn. And outside the window, the town of Bell's Hollow was dark and quiet in a way that felt tonight less like peace and more like the held breath before something. He sat there for a long time. Then he opened the desk drawer and took out a second piece of paper that he kept there folded in three. He had kept it for several years. He looked at it now in the way a man looks at an object he has been carrying because he cannot put it down, hoping that enough time will change what it means. It was a letter. A woman's handwriting. A return address in Abilene, Texas. He had intercepted it from the post 2 years ago, recognized the handwriting on the envelope, and never delivered it. He held it for a moment. Then he set it back in the drawer and closed it. Outside, Bell's Hollow breathed in the dark. In the morning, everything would either hold or it would not. And the Reverend had spent 22 years building the kind of walls that held, and he could not yet bring himself to believe that two men at the edge of town, and a girl with a bundle of belongings and a borrowed shawl were going to be the thing that finally showed him what walls were worth. He blew out the candle. The room went dark. They left Dry Creek Ridge before the sun had cleared the eastern mesas. The air was cold in the way that October air is cold before the light arrives to do something about it, carrying the mineral smell of the canyon and the distant sweetness of sage that had been warmed by yesterday and not yet lost it. Caleb had hitched the mule to the small cart, and the three of them rode down the canyon track in the particular quiet of people who have said what needs saying and are now inside the saying of it. A mile from town, Eliza asked him to stop. He pulled the mule to a halt without asking why. The track ran straight here between two low walls of sandstone that caught the first light and held it amber. She climbed down from the cart and stood on the road and looked at the shape of Bell's Hollow. In the distance, the chapel roof visible above the line of the other buildings, the way it had always been visible from every direction, as if the town had arranged itself to keep it in view. She turned to Caleb. "This part is mine," she said. He looked at her in the way he had of looking at things, without the decoration of expression, without commentary. He had been looking at her this way for several weeks now, and she had come to understand what it meant. It meant he was paying attention. It meant what she said was being heard by someone who was not calculating how to respond to it while she was still speaking. "I know," he said. "I need you outside, not inside. I'll be at the rail." She looked at Emmett. "I'll be wherever you don't need me to be," he said, which was, she thought, the most useful thing anyone had said to her in a very long time. She turned toward town and started walking. Harwick met her at the edge of the main road, coming from the direction of his office on foot, his hat on straight in his expression, carrying the settled quality of a man who has slept on a decision and found it still standing in the morning. He fell into step beside her without ceremony. He did not offer his arm. He did not position himself in front of her. He simply walked next to her at her pace, which was not slow and was not hurried, the pace of someone who has somewhere to be and has decided to be there. The town noticed her arrival. Bell's Hollow was a place that noticed things without appearing to, in the way of small communities that have elevated the management of social information to something close to an art form. She could feel it as she walked, the slight reorganization of activity in her peripheral vision, the heads that turned and held the conversations that did not quite stop but changed their register. She had walked this street for 5 years as something the town had arranged itself around without acknowledging. She was walking it now as something else, and the difference was legible in the way the air around her arranged itself. Sister Constance Weld was on the steps of the dry goods store when Eliza passed. She looked up from the package she was tying, and her hands went still, and she looked at Eliza's face in the direct morning light. Eliza did not stop. She did not look away. She walked past and heard behind her the sound of the package being set down on the step. At the chapel, the doors were already open. Harwick pushed them wider without knocking and went in first, which was a choice, and Eliza followed him. The chapel smelled of candle wax and old wood, in the specific dusty sanctity of a building that has been used for the same purpose for a long time. The morning light came through the east windows in long slanted columns and fell across the empty pews in a way that made them look expectant. They were not empty for long. The word moved through Bell's Hollow in the rapid, efficient way that words move when the situation has already made the town alert. People came. Not all of them, not at first, but enough, and then more than enough, filing into the pews with the uncertain compliance of people responding to something they can feel the weight of without yet knowing its shape. The Reverend's Wednesday assembly had primed them. They were already in the posture of a community that has been told it is facing a moment of reckoning. And now the reckoning had arrived in a form none of them had anticipated. Reverend Cross was at the front of the chapel. He had been there, Eliza understood immediately, because he had known this was coming. He had the particular composed readiness of a man who has spent the night preparing for something and has prepared well. His coat was perfect. His collar was perfect. His face held the controlled warmth of 22 years of Sunday mornings, and it held it with an effort that was not visible unless you knew what the effort looked like from underneath. He looked at Eliza coming down the center aisle. and something moved behind his eyes that he did not permit to reach his face. "This is highly irregular," he said, addressing Harwick. His voice carried its full authority, the deep assurance of a man whose voice has been the largest in this room for 2 decades. "I would ask what the meaning of this intrusion is." "We're holding testimony," Harwick said. "Here, now." He looked at the congregation filling the pews. "Everyone stays." Cross drew himself up. He was a tall man, and he knew how to use his height. "On whose authority do you presume to commandeer this house of worship for whatever proceeding you have in mind?" "Mine," Harwick said. One word, flat, final, the voice of a man who has been deciding for 2 days and is done deciding. A silence. Then Eliza walked to the pulpit. She did not hurry. She climbed the 3 steps to the pulpit platform and stood where Reverend Edmund Cross had stood for 22 years and looked out over the congregation of Bell's Hollow, which was looking back at her with the collective held breath of people who do not yet know what they are about to be asked to hold. She was 19 years old. She had honey blonde hair pulled back from her face because she had put it back before leaving the cabin that morning without thinking about it, the way you do things that have become reflex. She was wearing a dress that had been washed and dried and worn again because it was what she had. Her hands were on the edges of the pulpit, and they were steady. She looked out at the room. She looked at the women from the kitchen who had been in the room the morning she said it hurt when she sat. She looked at the families in the center pews who had nodded along to 22 years of sermons about grace and submission. She looked at Constance Weld, who had come in and taken a seat near the back and was sitting with her hands in her lap and her eyes on Eliza in the specific, focused way of someone who has finally opened a drawer they have been avoiding. She did not look at the Reverend. She took the 2 letters from inside her dress, where she had carried them against her chest through the night and the cold of the morning, and she unfolded them and she held them up so the congregation could see that they existed. "This is a letter," she said. "It was written by a woman named Clara Sims. She was in this house before me." She read it. She read it in the voice she had developed over 5 years of reading prayers aloud and household accounts and the shopping list that Hester Cross handed her on market days, a voice that had learned to carry information clearly and without decoration. The words of the letter fell into the chapel's acoustics and spread outward, and there was nowhere for them to go except into the ears of the people sitting in the pews, and those people did not move. She read the part about the room. She read the part about the lock on the wrong side of the door. She read the part about the Reverend's comment about the previous arrangement. She read the last line. We chose to believe her. When she finished, the chapel was silent in a way that it had not been silent before, even in prayer. This was a different quality of silence. This was the silence of a room in which something has been said that the room does not know how to absorb because it has no prepared category for it. Then she put the letters down and she looked out at the congregation and she said, "I told someone in this room that it hurt when I sat down. I said it once, and everyone in this room looked away." She did not say it with accusation. She did not say it with heat. She said it the same way she said everything, flatly, clearly, as a fact being entered into a record. "I'm not here to punish anyone for that," she said. "I understand why you looked away. I understand what it costs to look at something when the looking has consequences. I have been paying that cost in a different way for 5 years, and I understand what it feels like to calculate it and decide the price is too high." She paused. "I'm asking something harder than punishment. I'm asking you not to forget. Not again. Not the next time you are in a room with someone and something in the room is telling you to look away. I'm asking you to remember that you were here this morning, that you heard this, and that knowing and doing nothing is its own kind of choice." She stepped back from the pulpit. Cross moved immediately. He came forward from where he had been standing to the side of the altar with the controlled urgency of a man who has been waiting for the appropriate moment to intervene and has determined that the moment has arrived. His voice came up into its full register, the voice that had stopped arguments and quieted grief and organized 22 years of Sunday mornings. "This is defamation," he said. "This is a deeply troubled young woman who has been influenced by individuals with no stake in this community. making accusations against a man who has devoted his entire adult life to its service. I have given everything to this church, to this congregation. I have buried your fathers and baptized your children, and I have done it in faithfulness to God and to you for 22 years. And I will not stand here and be diminished by the word of someone who has no standing. I was speaking to the congregation, not to Eliza. He had made a calculation, which was that the congregation was his audience and had always been his audience and would remain so because they had been his audience for too long to become anything else in a single morning. Harwick stepped into his path. "Sit down, Edmund," he said, quietly, without drama. The two words of a man who has made a decision he is not going to revisit. Cross looked at him. "Silas, I want you to think very carefully about what you are doing. This community's trust in its institutions is not something that can be rebuilt once it has been damaged. You are making a choice this morning that will define your tenure in this office for as long as this town stands." "I know it," Harwick said. "Sit down." A silence. It lasted perhaps 5 seconds. It felt longer. Cross looked at the sheriff, and at some point in those 5 seconds, something in his calculations shifted because he could see in Harwick's face what he had not expected to see: the absence of negotiation. Not hostility, not ambition. Simply the closed face of a man who has looked at a thing long enough to be done with looking and has moved to a different kind of engagement. Cross turned to the congregation. "I was going to speak again." You could see it in the way he gathered himself, the slight expansion of the chest, the lift of the chin. He was a man who had always been able to speak his way through a room, and he was reaching for that capacity now. And then from the back of the chapel, a sound. Not a voice, not a word, just the sound of something shifting, the creak of an old pew as someone stood up. It was Constance Weld. She did not speak. She simply stood with her hands at her sides and her back straight and looked at the front of the room. Her face had the complicated expression of a person who has been carrying something for several days and has just set it down, not with relief exactly, but with the specific gravity of someone who understands that setting it down was always the only option and has finally accepted this. Another creak, another person standing. A young widow named Martha Fielding from the middle of the left section, who stood without meeting anyone's eyes, simply adding her presence to the geometry of the room. Then two more, then another. Then from the very back of the chapel, from the pew nearest the door where she had always sat in 22 years of services, Hester Cross rose from her seat. The room felt this. Hester Cross stood. She did not look at her husband. She did not look at Eliza. She looked at a fixed point somewhere in the middle distance between the pulpit and the east windows. And her face was doing something that faces do when several years of held things find simultaneous release, which is not the face of grief exactly, and not the face of relief exactly, but something that contains both and cannot settle into either. A single tear moved down her cheek. She did not wipe it away. The Reverend looked at his wife. He looked at her for what seemed like a long time, though it was probably only a moment. He looked at her with the expression of a man who has just understood that the last wall of a structure he has spent his life building will not hold. Not with fury, not with the heat of someone who has been betrayed. With something colder and more final, the expression of a man arriving at an understanding he is not going to be able to refuse. He turned. He walked to the side door of the chapel, the door that opened onto the alley rather than the main steps. He did not take his Bible. He did not take his hat. He pushed the door open and stepped through it, and it swung shut behind him. No sermon, no scripture, no final word. The chapel held his absence the way it had held his presence for 22 years, not with silence, but with a changed quality of air, as if the room itself had been exhaling something it no longer needed to hold. Eliza stepped down from the pulpit. She walked the length of the center aisle with the same unhurried pace she had walked in with, and she pushed through the main doors and came out into the October morning where the light was full and direct, and the main road of Bell's Hollow was empty because everyone who had been on it was now inside the chapel. She stopped on the top step, across the road at the hitching rail. Caleb Rourke stood with his arms crossed and his hat low and his eyes on the chapel doors. He had been there since she went in. He had not moved. She came down the steps and crossed the road. She stopped 2 feet from him and looked up at him in the full morning light. They stood, she said. Good, he said. She looked at him for a moment, this large, quiet man who had spent 11 years not speaking and had chosen from all the things he could have spent a voice on, when he finally used it again, to use it on the truth. You didn't come in, she said. It wasn't mine to come into. Behind her, the chapel doors had opened, and people were beginning to come out, moving in the slow, uncertain way of people who have been somewhere that rearranged them and have not yet found the shape of what comes next. Voices started tentative at first, and then more the specific sound of a community beginning to process something collectively that it has only just understood. She did not turn to look at it. Then from somewhere behind the chapel, out of sight, the bell began to ring. Not the controlled, deliberate ringing of a scheduled service. Not the summoning rhythm that the Reverend had always used. Something more uneven, more human. The sound of someone pulling the rope who had not done it many times before, getting the rhythm, and then losing it slightly and finding it again. Nobody could have said whose hands were on it. Nobody came forward afterward to claim it. The bell rang over Bell's Hollow in the October light, and the sound carried east toward the canyon and the ridge beyond it, where if you were standing at a certain point on the hillside above the old homestead, you could hear it as a faint and intermittent music coming from the town below. Emmett Garrow, riding back up the canyon track from where he had stopped to wait, heard it and pulled his horse to a halt. He sat there for a moment listening to it, and something in his face arranged itself into an expression that was not happiness exactly, but was the quality that arrives when something you owe has been paid in full, when a debt that has been carried for years settles finally into its accounting and releases. He turned his horse toward the ridge and rode slowly toward the homestead, letting the bell do whatever the bell was doing without him. When he reached the homestead that afternoon, Caleb was at the fence and Eliza was inside. Emmett tied his horse and sat on the bench outside without being invited, which was how he had started with Caleb a month ago at the forge, and seemed like the right way to continue. After a while, Caleb came over, and they sat without talking for a long time, listening to the canyon settle into evening. The light went from gold to copper to the thin violet that precedes dark, and neither of them said anything about what had happened that morning because some things do not require a ceremony. They only require that you show up and then that you stay after. The Reverend was gone by the end of the week. No service, no official announcement, no pastoral letter to the congregation explaining or defending or seeking understanding. He simply ceased to be present in the cross house, and then the cross house was locked, and then the locked house sat on the main road of Bell's Hollow in a silence that the town moved carefully around, the way you move around something that has fallen and you are not yet sure of the full extent of the damage. A note had been left on his desk. Its contents were never made public. The two people who read it, Harwick and the head of the church board, exchanged a look afterward that communicated something complete and private and set the note aside. Within 3 days, Hester Cross had the house closed. She left on the morning stage with her trunk in a single carpet bag and her face covered by a travel veil, moving through the stage depot with the focused efficiency of a woman who has decided that brevity is the only remaining form of dignity available to her. Before she left, she placed a folded piece of paper on the chapel steps, weighted against the morning wind, with the small river rock that had sat on the windowsill of the Cross kitchen for as long as anyone could remember. It was addressed in handwriting that people who had received household notes from Hester Cross over the years would have recognized precise upright with the slight leftward lean of someone who had been taught to write by a strict schoolmistress. It said, "I knew. I am sorry." Nothing else. No request. No qualification. No scripture. Eliza read it once, standing at the chapel steps in the early morning, with the rock in one hand and the paper in the other. She stood with it for a moment, then she folded it and put it in her pocket and went on with her day. She did not answer it. There was no address to answer to, and some things do not need answering. Some things need only to have been said. Silas Harwick wrote to the Weston home in Abilene within a week. He wrote as sheriff of Harlan County, New Mexico, formally documenting what he knew, what he had observed, and what the letter from Clara Sims had established. He requested any additional records the home maintained relating to Clara Sims's admission and the circumstances under which it had been arranged. He wrote a second letter to the county administrative office in Santa Fe, describing the situation in Bells Hollow and requesting guidance on the appropriate legal procedure for an investigation into a former community leader now absent from the territory. These letters went into channels that moved slowly, the way official channels always move, but they went, they were logged, they were assigned. They would, in the months and years that followed, produce consequences that were imperfect and incomplete and real. This is how institutions change, not through single dramatic reversals, but through the accumulation of documents in drawers, letters on desks, names in files. The slow archaeological work of establishing that something happened and that it was known. Harwick was not under any illusion that the letters would fix everything, or perhaps anything, in the short term. But he was also not anymore the man who had leaned back in his chair and told Caleb Rourke that what he was describing was observation rather than proof. That man had made a calculation he had been comfortable with. The calculation had not changed. The comfort had. He wrote the letters and sent them and went back to work, which was the only available response to having finally done the thing you should have done 3 weeks ago. Emmett Garrow wrote his own letter, not to Abilene, to Chicago. He wrote to the Pinkerton National Detective Agency attention of the senior director of the Western Operations Office on a Thursday evening in late October, with a lamp lit against the early dark and his cattle settled in the near pasture, in the particular silence of a man alone in a house he has built around himself for protection and is now willing to let air move through. He described the Memphis case. He described the evidence. He described the instruction he had received and the compliance he had offered, and the names of the women whose situations had been made worse by that compliance. He did not ask for anything. He did not propose a course of action. He did not express hope that the letter would produce a particular outcome. He simply created the record that he had declined to create in 1864 and had been not creating for 7 years since. Whether the letter produced anything he never knew for certain. 3 months later, he received a brief acknowledgement from a mid-level administrator that the matter had been received and was being reviewed. He did not hear anything further for a long time. But the record existed now. It had not existed before. This was not nothing. He put the pen down and blew out the lamp and sat in the dark of the kitchen for a while, not thinking about anything in particular, just sitting the way a man sits when he has been carrying a weight for so long that the absence of it feels strange, and he needs a moment before he gets up and figures out what he carries next. In Bells Hollow, Sister Constance Weld began sweeping the chapel steps each morning. She did not announce this. She did not explain it to anyone. She simply appeared each morning before the early services with the same wide broom that Eliza had used to sweep those steps, and she swept them with the slow, deliberate attention of someone performing a task that contains more than its surface meaning. She swept the grit and dust that the desert delivered nightly. She swept the fallen leaves as October moved toward November. She swept without hurrying and without making a ceremony of it. In the town of Bells Hollow, which noticed everything, noticed this and said nothing about it, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. The congregation continued. A different man led services, a younger minister brought in from the county seat, while the board conducted a search. He was a quiet man, less magnetic, more careful, the kind of preacher who asks questions from the pulpit more often than he provides answers, which some people found less satisfying, and others found cautiously something close to relief. The pews were not as full as they had been. They filled back up over months in the gradual way that communities return to their habits after disruption. Never quite the same configuration as before, but finding new arrangements that serve well enough. Bells Hollow went on being Bells Hollow, which was not a transformation, but was also not nothing. At Dry Creek Ridge, Eliza Ward built something. She had told Caleb she was not ready to rest yet. She had told him she wanted to build rather than simply inhabit, And she had meant it in the way that people mean things when they are done performing contentment and have started telling the truth about what they actually want. He had given her the homestead as an offer, and she had received it as a project. There was a distinction, and he understood it and did not press it. The fence came first, then the main structure's roof, which had three places where the boards had gone soft and needed replacement. Then the shutter she had mentioned on the first morning, which she measured and cut herself from lumber. Caleb brought from the yard in town with a level and a handsaw she had asked him to show her how to use, and which she had then used without being watched. Because she did not need to be watched, she needed the saw. Behind the main building, she put in a kitchen garden. Lavender along the south wall because it came back every year without being asked. Thyme and sage in the raised beds she built from the flat stones she dug out of the hillside. A small plot for kitchen herbs that she knew from her mother's instructions, which she had not thought about in years, and found when she went looking for them, were still there complete and intact, stored somewhere beneath the years of other things. She bought her own horse at the November market, a steady gray mare that she named nothing because she did not name things without first understanding them. And she rode into Bell's Hollow on her own, on market days, and bought what she needed and returned. And the town made space for her in the way that towns make space for things that have declared themselves permanent. On the evenings when the work was done and the light was still good enough to sit by, she and Caleb sat on the porch he had built along the front of the homestead and were quiet together in the way they had found, which was not the quiet of people who have nothing to say, but of people who have enough room to not say things when not saying them is what the moment calls for. One evening in November, with the desert going purple and orange and the last of the light in the air carrying the first real edge of the coming winter, Caleb told her about Rose, not about her death, about her life. He told it slowly in the halting way of someone who has not spoken about something for a long time and is finding the words where he left them, surprised to discover they are still there. He told her about the wildflowers on the anvil arranged with the specific deliberateness of a 7-year-old who has decided that flowers are important and placement matters. He told her about the wooden horse he had carved for her 6th birthday, a week's evenings of work, and how she had held it the morning she received it with the careful reverence of someone receiving something they understand is made of time. He told her about the cedar tree on the hillside in Colorado, where Rose was buried, the one she had named when she was 5 because she said it looked like it was listening, and how he had gone back to stand under it once 2 years after her death, and found that it had grown considerably and was still, as far as he could tell, paying attention. I told her about the way Rose fell asleep mid-sentence sometimes and woke in the middle of the next one, as if sleep had been a brief administrative interruption in a continuous thought. Eliza listened with her hands in her lap and her face toward the last of the light, and did not speak for a long time after he finished. The silence between them was the good kind, the kind that has room in it. Then she said, "She sounds like someone who would have been very kind." She was, he said. The words came out quietly, the way things come out when they are true and have always been true, and you have not said them out loud for a long time. Like her mother. A pause, a moment in which the desert held still. Like you. The fire crackled in the small outdoor hearth they had built from the canyon stones. The mare shifted in the barn with the easy restlessness of a well-fed animal settling for the night. Above them, the New Mexico sky assembled its extraordinary arrangement of stars, which it did every night without concern for whether anyone was looking. Neither of them spoke again for a while. What was between them was not named that evening and did not need to be. It was present in the way that real things are present, not requiring announcement, not requiring ceremony. Simply there in the space between two people who have seen each other clearly and chosen on the basis of that seeing to remain. The summer fair came to Bell's Hollow in June, as it always did, with its fiddles and its corn cakes and its particular quality of collective relief, the relief of a community that has come through something difficult and emerged into the easier light of a summer afternoon and needs to remember how to enjoy itself. The square was full. Children ran between the stalls, and the adults let them because June in the territory had a quality that made strictness feel unreasonable. The fiddlers played something fast, and people who would not ordinarily dance found themselves at the edges of dancing. The smells of the food stalls drifted down the main road and drew people from the surrounding ranches who did not normally come to town except on necessity. It was into this scene that a wagon turned off the east road and came down the main street of Bell's Hollow. Eliza Ward drove it herself. The gray mare was in good condition, well brushed, wearing a cleaned harness. Eliza wore a dress she had made herself from a length of blue cotton she had bought in April, simple and well cut without the elaborate construction of what a woman was supposed to wear, or the bare, threadbare quality of what she had worn for 5 years. Just a dress she had made because she had decided she wanted it and had the skill to make it. She pulled the wagon to a stop at the edge of the square and climbed down and took from the back a basket covered with a cloth. And she carried this basket to an empty space at the stall row near the far end of the square next to the ironwork display that Caleb had set up earlier that morning. She put the basket down and removed the cloth. Inside were things she had made over the winter and spring. Small pieces of embroidery on linen, a set of herb sachets she had sewn from the lavender and sage from the garden, a few items of practical needlework, mended gloves and reinforced collars, things that had been left undone in households where time was short, which she had offered to help with, and had been cautiously at first, and then with increasing ease accepted. She arranged them on the stall table with care, and stood back and looked at what she had. The fair moved around her. People passed. A few stopped. A child asked about the embroidery on a handkerchief, a small running stitch pattern that Eliza had learned from her mother on a winter afternoon in Ohio when she was 8 years old and the world had been a different size. "It's called a stem stitch," Eliza told her. "Your mother could teach you." The child looked at the handkerchief and then at Eliza with the direct, unself-conscious assessment of children and said, "It's pretty," and moved on. After a while, Constance Weld crossed the square. She came from the direction of the food stalls with a small parcel in her hands, and she moved toward Eliza's stall without appearing to decide to the way you move towards something you have already made up your mind about. She stopped at the edge of the table and looked at the items laid out on it. She picked up one of the linen pieces and looked at it closely at the fine, even work of it. She set it down and she looked at Eliza. "They're beautiful," she said. 2 words, simple words, not an apology, not a declaration, not the particular performance of remorse that expects the other person to receive it as a gift. Just 2 words that were exactly what they said. "Thank you," Eliza said, and that was that. Constance moved on to the next stall, and Eliza turned to the next customer, and the fair continued around them both, as it always had, loud and warm and full of the ordinary human appetite for company and sweetness, and the temporary forgetting of difficulty. At the edge of the square, under the shade of the building that had once been the barber shop and was now a hardware store, Caleb Rourke stood with Emmett Garrow beside him. Neither of them was doing anything in particular. They were simply there the way men stand when they have come somewhere to see something and have found it and are content to look. "She'll be all right," Emmett said. It was not a question. It had the sound of a statement being made for the record, a fact entered into an ongoing account. "She was always going to be," Caleb said. The fiddles found a new key. Someone in the middle of the square started clapping the rhythm, and other people joined people joining it, the way summer permits without requiring a reason. The children ran. The dust rose and caught the afternoon light and hung in it briefly, brilliant and indifferent, before settling back. Bell's Hollow moved through its summer fair with the noisy, ordinary persistence of a place that has endured something and decided not without cost and not without remainder to continue. There is one final thing. The note that Eliza had left on the threshold of the cross house, on the night she left tucked into the knot of her shawl bundle, the note that said, "If anything happens to me, please give this to the man who noticed." This note had been found by the Reverend that first morning. He had read it and recognized her handwriting and put it in his coat pocket along with the letter from Abilene that he had kept in his desk drawer for 2 years and that had not been delivered. When the Reverend left Bell's Hollow, he left both of these things behind. Whether by oversight or by some final accounting of his own that he did not explain to anyone, he left them in the desk drawer in his study, which Harwick opened when he entered the vacated house to document its contents. Harwick took both documents. He returned the Abilene letter to Emmett, who had sent the original inquiry and who read it again with the stillness of someone confirming what they already knew. Then Harwick folded Eliza's note and rode out to Dry Creek Ridge and handed it to Caleb without a word and turned and rode back. Caleb read it once. He read it in the evening, sitting alone on the porch after Eliza had gone inside for the night with the canyon dark and full and the stars doing what they always did. He read it and he held it for a while. Then he went to the shelf inside the cabin where he kept the satchel that had traveled with him for 11 years. The satchel that held Rose's hair ribbons and the wooden horse he had made for her 6th birthday. He put the note inside, folded against the ribbons. He closed the satchel. He did not show it to Eliza. She had written it in a moment of particular darkness, not knowing what the night would hold or what the morning would bring. And it belonged to that moment and to the person she had been in it. And he understood without needing to discuss it that some things are not for showing. Some things are for keeping, for carrying quietly in a worn piece of leather with the other objects that represent what a person has loved and what it cost them and what they chose to do with the cost. She had written it to him. He had it now. The canyon held the dark the way it always held it, which was without effort and without promise. Simply present, simply itself. The patient geology of a world that has been here longer than any of the things that happen on its surface and will be here after all of them. Above Dry Creek Ridge, the stars were extraordinary. They were always extraordinary. They did not require an occasion.